Good afternoon. I'm Nancy Wada McKee, Vice President for Student Life and the moderator for this event. I'd like to welcome you to our Wellbeing U speaker series featuring Dr. Erica Holmes. Dr. Holmes will speak to us about trauma and recovery, critical topics as we work through the COVID-19 pandemic. If you have questions, I invite you to submit them via the Q&A tool. Dr. Holmes will answer them at the end of her talk as time permits. We will begin with a welcome by our First Lady, Dr. Debbie Covino, followed by introductory remarks from President Covino. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Debbie Covino.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy that we can be here together today. And as I keep saying, I hope everyone is staying well and doing as well as possible. We know that's been difficult lately. Welcome to Wellbeing U's speaker series at Cal State LA. Before we hear from Dr. Erica Holmes about the issues of trauma and toxic stress, especially important subjects in this time of COVID, as I'm sure you'd all agree, I'd like to thank you, for joining us and being with us today via Zoom. The good news is that we're getting closer to the day when Bill and I will be able to be in the same room with you again. We're all really looking forward to that. For now, though, I'm glad you're out there, and we're, happy that we can be with you in this format for now. You're probably aware that what is now called Wellbeing U has hosted a wonderful speaker series throughout the years that has allowed us to have discussions about, really important subjects such as destigmatizing mental illness, self-care in a time of national crisis, the intersection between social justice and spirituality, suicide prevention, indigenous healing practices, and the way in which technology has reshaped our world, among other really essential subjects. Today's discussion is another really essential contribution to our effort through the speaker series to contribute to your well-being and awareness, and to remind you that you are all part of a caring campus community. Before I hand the spotlight over to President Bill Covino to introduce Dr. Holmes, let me say once again, welcome, and thank you for giving me the pleasure of opening the valuable discussion that is about to begin. Bill?
Thank you, Debbie. Welcome, everybody, to another important chapter in the Wellbeing U speaker series. Thank you for joining us today for this talk on trauma and toxic stress, probably a phrase that all too many of us can identify with in one way or another as we've navigated through the months of the pandemic. It's been 1 year, almost exactly 1 year since the pandemic turned our world upside down. What we've witnessed, heard about, and experienced in the past year has been difficult, to say the least. The pandemic has created new challenges, exacerbated already difficult problems, and left us all with a need to understand the impact of trauma and toxic stress. Even today, as the nation begins to emerge from the pandemic, with more people becoming vaccinated, we must continue to deal with the negative impact that it has had on our mental well-being. That's why this series is so important. That's why this talk is so important, and why I find the topic hopeful. Today, we'll offer, I trust, an understanding of trauma and toxic stress and how to stay on a path to recovery. Our guest speaker is Dr. Erica Holmes, a clinical psychologist who serves as an associate program chair and the director of the Psychological Trauma Studies specialization in the Masters in Psychology program at Antioch University, Los Angeles. She's also the executive director for the Champion Counseling Center, the founder of a consulting business, and widely active in initiatives that really make a difference. Dr. Holmes has provided psychotherapy and counseling, training and consultation, education and research services to individuals and organizations for more than 20 years. Her work stems from a desire to assist individuals, communities, and organizations to heal and to grow and to develop in good ways. Her areas of inquiry and more than 150 presentations focus on psychological trauma, relationships and coupling, equity, belonging and empowerment, psychotherapy with African American clients, and the integration of Christianity and psychology. With all that expertise and dedication before us, we'll now hear from Dr. Erica Holmes.
Thank you so much, President Covino, First Lady, Dr. Covino, and Vice President of Student Life, Dr. Nancy Wada-McKee. It is such an honor to be here today. I don't think that most folks know that the Cal State system is near and dear to my heart, because the Cal State system has played an integral part in my family for 3 generations. My mother completed her bachelor's degree after migrating to Los Angeles from Arkansas at Cal State Dominguez Hills. When I left high school, I began my studies actually at Cal State LA, subsequently finishing at Cal State Dominguez Hills. And my son is now a senior at Cal State San Francisco State. So the Cal State system has really been integral in my life story, my family's life story. So I'm really, really excited to be here and excited to talk about toxic stress and trauma and a pathway towards healing, which I think is so important, especially given that we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel with the COVID vaccines and the availability increasing in Cal State LA, so graciously being a super site and helping LA County move towards looking back on this global pandemic. So I'm really excited to be here. I have about 55 minutes or so for my talk. I'm going to try to squeeze everything in. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I have a PowerPoint presentation for you. I'll share my screen and we will get into the meat of the presentation. And I look forward to your answering questions at the end. So let's talk about toxic stress and trauma and toxic stress and its recovery. So what I want to kind of focus on today are 4 primary areas. I want to talk about how we're all affected and how that differs in this crisis versus other crises that we've experienced in the United States. Kind of differentiate between stress and trauma, that although they're related, they're actually different in some ways. The ways that they impact our being is different. So I want to differentiate between those slightly. I want to talk about then what do we do next? How do we go from surviving this global pandemic to actually thriving, and introduce to you a concept called post-traumatic growth, abbreviated here as PTG. And then I want to talk about another psychological concept, self-compassion, remembering self-compassion as we move into the next normal. So those are the 4 areas that I will cover today in my talk. So first, let me begin by saying events over the past 12 months have been a source of unexpected stress and adversity for all of us. And I think that we can all agree on that. the effects of the global pandemic, which, as President Covino said, we're coming up on the 1-year anniversary. The racial uprising that took our country by storm in the middle of this pandemic last year in the summer. And then also the political unrest that we've seen over the last 6 months, culminating in January, will be felt for years to come, that the impact of those things will be felt by all of us for years to come. And what I really want to discuss is the long-term effects of that stress and trauma, and really have us think about strategies to help us look towards the future and embracing our next normal. But consciously remembering that we have survived major incidents over this last 12 months that I would safely say that most of us, if not all of us, were not prepared for psychologically, emotionally, financially, or physically. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward. So I want to talk a little bit about typical crises. What happens in a typical crisis? Well, in a typical crisis usually has a rippling effect, like water, like a rock in water. There's a rippling effect. And there are degrees of impact. So in a typical crisis, you have those who are deeply impacted in the middle, and then it ranges all the way to those who are completely unaware that there's a crisis, and therefore they're unaffected. So the deeply impacted folks in the middle are, if you think about that rock hitting the water, those individuals are where the rock hits the water. Those individuals in a typical crisis have been directly impacted by that rock, or they were directly hit by that rock. So these are individuals who might have been displaced, lost a loved one, had a harrowing escape. There might have been some physical impairment as a result of the crisis. They may have been hospitalized or emotionally overwhelmed in the middle. And then moving outward, you have those who are affected. So these are the folks who were not actually hit by the rock, but felt the splash of the water or the wave. And so those people, when we think about those people who have been affected, those are people who might have, as a result of whatever the crisis was, might have lost their job. Their home might have been affected. If we think about the wildfires that were rampant in California last year, these might have been people whose homes didn't burn down, but their homes might have been affected by smoke. Their streets might have been closed off because there were so many homes that had been affected. They might have lost neighbors or friends or something to that degree. And then moving out from those who are affected, the next group of people are those who are aware of what is happening and they're inconvenienced. So they weren't hit by the rock, they weren't splashed by the waves or the water, but in some way they were inconvenienced. These might have been people who had planned to travel to the location where the crisis was, but they had to cancel their vacation plans. Or, I mean, if we think about another like national disaster, if we think about, for example, Hurricane Katrina, people might have been taking their children to New Orleans to go on college tours, and they couldn't do that. Or, you know, people are aware inconvenience, might not be able to go to restaurants or something like that. So they know that there is a crisis and it is impacting their plans in some way, but it inconveniences them, but there's no real major effect. The next group are those who are aware, but are unaffected. Generally, when there's a large natural disaster, those might be folks who are living in a different county or a different location, a different state, for example, and they see it on the TV. They may feel some empathy for those individuals who are impacted, but they themselves are not directly impacted by by the crisis itself. And then you have that last group, the outer group. Those are folks who are unaware and also unaffected. So these are people who might not have caught the story about what's happening in another part of town or another state or another part of the country. They didn't catch it on the news. They weren't informed. They're unaware, and it does not impact their lives at all. And so in a typical crisis, you have these groups, and usually it is the folks who are in the unaffected category who provide resources to those who are deeply impacted and affected. So it is the people in a typical crisis who provide human resources, meaning physical labor or skills, ideas to help to manage the crisis or to help folks get on their feet, financial resources, they provide skills, they provide materials. These are people who might come in and volunteer. They might volunteer their home or whatever resources they have. It's usually the people who are in the unaffected categories who provide those resources for those who are impacted or deeply impacted. Well, this global pandemic, if we talk about just the global pandemic has essentially affected everyone everywhere. And because of that, there are fewer human resources and financial resources available to assist. And so what makes the COVID-19 virus and also some of the political unrest in the United States and the social justice uprising different is that everyone has been affected. And when this happens, we like to talk, we use a term called the wounded helper or the wounded healer. And what that means, if you can imagine or picture in your mind someone with a broken leg attempting to assist someone who is completely crippled or disabled in their legs, they can't walk, who has no mobility in their legs. So someone who's crippled is trying to help someone without mobility. And so they're both are suffering from or are experiencing some level of disability, but they're trying to assist and help each other. And that's what we're seeing in this COVID-19 during this COVID-19 pandemic, that all of us have been impacted to some degree. And because of that, the human resources that we often need and use to help recover after there is a large crisis or disaster, that has been depleted. It's not as plentiful. And it is impacting our ability to kind of rebound as quickly as we generally do as a nation after a crisis. So it is important also to remember that although we've all been impacted, we have been impacted in different ways. And so we've all been impacted, which means that we are all in the same storm, but it is important for us to remember that we're not in the same boat, that the impact has been very disproportionate depending on people's resources prior to the global pandemic, also those who are targets of injustice, and also as it relates to the political unrest. And even if you think about the constituents at Cal State LA, there's a disproportionate impact on the various groups on the campus. So when you think about staff, faculty, and students, each of those groups are impacted differently, and then individuals within those groups are impacted differently. You're looking at differences in those who have experienced the illness themselves, and also deaths in the family, the number of losses that have been experienced. So you have losses of people, you have losses of places, then you have some intangible losses. Some individuals may have had to stop pursuing their goals, for example, as a result of the pandemic. So losses, and also, access to the vaccine, which has to do with our tiered system, age, vulnerability, job description. So all of those things create a different way that we're all experiencing or being impacted by this pandemic. But what we do know is that each person's circumstances affects their perception of and how they respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, the political unrest, and calls for justice. And however, it is very fair to say that the storm has caused some level of stress for all of us. So regardless of our boat, all of us have been impacted, and the storm has caused some level of stress for all of us. So right now I want to transition to talking about 3 different types of stress: eustress, new stress, and distress. And generally, we don't talk about these 3 types of stress. We generally talk about distress because that's the one that causes the most disruption and the one that we don't like a lot. However, there are 3 types of stress. So the first is eustress. And eustress, we consider a positive form of stress or good stress. It actually is motivating and inspiring, and it causes a response in our body that allows for our body to react to the demands of the situation. Eustress is not defined by a stressor type, but how we perceive the actual stressor in our lives. But eustress really gives us it propels us towards our goals. It propels us to be able to accomplish those things or do those things that might cause us stress. It generally gives us a feeling, it occurs, or positive stress occurs when we have feelings of control, desirability, and also it's timed correctly. So those things that might be, are examples of eustress, are things like getting a promotion on a job, getting a new job, having a new baby, buying a new home. Those things we think of as positive events in our lives, but they cause stress, some level of anxiety. However, it's positive or good stress because those are often things that we feel we can control. They're desirable. They're timed generally at a good time. Like, when is there a bad time for a promotion? There might be one, but most of us are happy. And so we meet those demands, the demands of that new thing, with hope and with vigor. So the next type of stress is new stress, which we often don't talk about a lot, but new stress, the new comes from a shortened version of the word neutral. And new stress is any situation that is perceived as unimportant or inconsequential. It is basically a type of stress that lies in the neutral zone. And it is a stress that doesn't cause any particular harm or grief to the individual. And it does not cause our bodies to have a stress reaction, which is associated with negative stress or distress. And it also does not cause our bodies to react with any motivation to change or to meet the demands. It's really just very neutral. I'm going to put that there. And then the third is distress. And this is what people usually refer to when they're talking about stress. It's basically the complete opposite of eustress in terms of its effects on the individuals. So negative stress causes anxiety and concern. And negative stress occurs when the demands of our lives exceed our internal or external capacities to manage or to meet those demands. And so it causes us anxiety and concerns because the demands supersede our abilities to meet them. So they become overwhelming. It is perceived distress is where those stressors or those demands are perceived to be outside of our abilities to cope. Distress feels unpleasant. It can lead to mental and physical problems, when that distress occurs over a long period of time and there's very little to no relief. Distress can be long-term or short-term, but over time that stress becomes harmful and it causes changes to our minds, to our bodies, and to our souls. It is important to note that distress, short-term distress, causes for our bodies to increase the stress hormone cortisol in order for our bodies to have enough energy and internal resources to attempt to meet those overwhelming demands. However, over a long period of time, experiencing those high levels of cortisol can actually create physical changes, cause physical changes in our bodies, which can result in things such as headaches, intestinal problems, things like high blood pressure or chronic illness. And so over time, long-term experiences of distress can be detrimental to our bodies, our minds, and our souls. And it is that type of stress that we call toxic stress, that experience of long-term distress that overwhelms our system. Now, how does stress differ from trauma? How does stress differ from trauma? Well, the word trauma itself is derived from a Greek word meaning wound. And so trauma, when we think about trauma is a more severe form of stress in terms of both the nature of the stressor and the type of reaction as a result of or to the stressor. And so when we think of trauma, we're thinking of major events that happen that are generally outside of the realm of everyday life. And they cause an immediate reaction to that experience. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But think about psychological trauma as being more severe and the stressors as being extraordinary. And we really focus on 3 areas of when we talk about psychological trauma. So the first area that we focus on when we think about psychological trauma is the event. So I'm going to give you 3 E's to kind of make it more simple, but we think about the event. So unlike distress can happen when the demands of everyday life responsibilities really overwhelm our abilities, our capacity to cope. However, when we think about trauma, we think about those extraordinary events that are not common in everyday life. We often think about those events that are life-threatening, things such as actual or threatened death, actual or threatened physical assault, actual or threatened sexual assault, or the loss of a loved one or someone that we're securely attached to. And so the events themselves cause an immediate stress reaction when they happen. Those events also can happen, a traumatic event can happen over an extended period of time. For example, a child who's being abused, a person who's in a domestic violence situation, also being under the threat of a virus that has taken thousands and thousands of lives. So a life-threatening event. And that event can be an event that has happened to the person themselves. So they've experienced it themselves. It can happen because they witnessed someone having that event or experiencing the event, or even hearing about that event happening to a loved one. Are 3 ways that a person can experience what we would consider a traumatic event. And when I say experience, that leads us to our second E, our second focal point when talking about trauma, and that is the experience of the event. So the event itself can be an extraordinary event. The effects of that event are dependent upon the experience. So how individuals experience that event. And so a traumatic event is known to cause long-lasting symptoms when that event overwhelms a person's usual way of coping and immediately ignites or triggers a neurobiological response. And we call that neurobiological response the fight, flight, or freeze response. Generally, when a person is exposed to a life-threatening event, not generally, but always, when a person is exposed to a life-threatening event, that event registers in the brain and the brain then sends signals to other parts of the body to in preparation to respond to that life-threatening event. And the three primary responses is that our bodies prepare to fight, our bodies prepare to flee, or our bodies freeze and become stoic or catatonic as a way of allowing the traumatic event to pass. That fight, flight, or freeze response is neurobiological. It is involuntary and controlled by the central nervous system. And when a person is unable to engage in strategies to successfully calm the central nervous system down once it has been triggered, that is when you see long-lasting symptoms as a result of that traumatic event. Now, it is important again to go back to stress. Long-term high levels of distress can also begin to trigger that fight, flight, or freeze response in the body. It's like a heightened sense of hypervigilance in the body. And you can begin to have symptoms in the same way that you would if there was one extraordinary event. So those two things can occur together, and they also can mirror or mimic each other. And so that leads into my third, which is I began to discuss is the effects. So the effects of experiencing a traumatic event are holistic. They impact a person's mind, their body, their soul, like as in stress and long-term distress. And it also has a neurobiological impact or effect on the person who has experienced it as well. And so when we look at traumatic events render victims helpless by overwhelming force. They involve threats to life or bodily integrity, or a personal encounter with violence or death. They disrupt a sense of control, connection, and meaning. They confront human beings with the extremities of helplessness and terror, and they evoke the responses of catastrophe and fight, flight, or freeze. And if we think about what we've been experiencing over this last year, I don't think that it can be argued that we haven't all been experiencing a collective trauma. That every day we hear news about the rapid spread of the virus, the latest death counts, and tragic stories of suffering and loss. And if we haven't been impacted by the virus personally, we worry about our own safety and the safety of others and our loved ones. These threats can feel unpredictable and uncontrollable, and they are the signature of a traumatic event. They disrupt our sense of control, connection, and meaning. Also, social distancing might make it harder for us to get comfort from the people close to us. And we may probably not have access to some of the normal activities we would do in order to soothe ourselves, to comfort ourselves, and to engage in self-care, such as exercise and leisure activities. Again, disrupting our sense of control, connection, and meaning. Also, the calls to end racial injustice continue. And we face collective trauma every day by hearing news about the latest death counts and tragic stories and human pain. And so all of these threats can feel unpredictable and uncontrollable and are the signature and hallmarks of traumatic events. So all of our lives have been disrupted, our sense of control about the things that are going on around us. They've dampened our ability to connect to each other, and also for many have shattered our fundamental beliefs about the world being safe and about our abilities to protect ourselves and our competence to be in control of our own lives. And so when we look at what has happened and what we've lived through in this last year, not only have many of us had 12 months of extreme distress, but we've also had direct experiences of trauma. So how do we think about these two things? How do we differentiate or think about these two things differently? So remembering that overwhelming toxic stress is an accumulation of prolonged extreme stress that is toxic to our system and produces adaptations to our body, to our behavior and our development, where trauma is a psychologically distressing event outside of the range of usual human experience and causes an instantaneous neurobiological response. Everyone experiences stress, but the accumulation of large quantities of stress over long periods of time changes that experience. As opposed to occasional stress, trauma has an impact on the brain, and that can be long lasting, meaning that fight, flight, or freeze response can continue in the person long after the trauma has subsided. And their brain then will become very sensitive to other experiences of other traumatic experiences. So when we think about trauma, I know that you have all had a presentation on self-care and the importance of self-care during this time. So what I wanted to do was to present a new idea to some of you called post-traumatic growth. I'm quite sure, as I mentioned, that all of us would agree that we have experienced distress, and maybe many of us would agree that we also have experienced traumatic events during this time. So we're aware of that. We know that stress impacts our bodies, that distress is not good for our bodies in the long term, and that trauma can have a neurobiological effect. But I also think that it is important for us to remember that not all is lost, that in the literature, we have identified a phenomenon that have been reported by many trauma survivors that could potentially give us a hopeful way of thinking about the future. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, remembering or knowing that we have vaccines now that are proving highly effective, that many states across the country are beginning to resume some operations, with California and Los Angeles County already in talks about resuming some of our operations, that we will come through this. And who will we be at the end of this, or when this is over? And so I want to introduce to you this concept of post-traumatic growth. How do we begin to look beyond what's happening today and look past or move past and put in the past to some degree what happened over this 12 months and begin to look towards the future? How can we do that? So I want to talk a little bit again about this concept of post-traumatic growth. So let's start here and talk about what are some of the potential responses to trauma. So if you look here, you can see my cursor, there's a baseline level of functioning. And then there's some adverse event that happens. The whole country and world is shut down due to a deadly virus. And the immediate reaction is that we succumb. And if we think about that succumbing, that is that fight, flight, or freeze, that survival response that happens when a traumatic event happens. One thing that I didn't mention is when we are in survival mode, that fight, flight, or freeze response, what happens is that the front part of our brain, so if we think about our brain having 3 parts, the back part of the brain where the spine is, that is our brain stem. It's our oldest part of the brain. It is first to start developing in utero. That part of the brain is responsible for like our bodily systems, our heart pumping, our blood flowing. So it's our central nervous system. This middle part of the brain, if we think about ear to ear, that's our limbic system. And housed within the limbic system on the right side is our amygdala. Our amygdala houses our emotions, including fear. So what happens is when there is a traumatic event or deeply stressful event, our brainstem and our middle part of our brain goes into survival mode. All we need to do is survive this event. And what it does is it hijacks, we call it hijacking the frontal lobe, this front part of our brain. The frontal lobe is the last part of our brain to develop. It is said that the frontal lobe continues to develop through research until we're about 25 years old. So it is the least developed when we are born, and it continues to develop. Again, this frontal part of our brain continues to develop throughout our life until we're about 25 years old. So in this succumbing, what happens is that our brainstem and our limbic system goes into fight, flight, or freeze, which means we just need to survive this right now. And it hijacks or shuts down our frontal lobe. Our frontal lobe is responsible for long-term planning, consequences, understanding consequences or thinking about consequences, planning, organizing, higher level computations, which are things that you don't need if you are trying to jump out of the way of a moving car. What you need to do is survive. You need to fight, flee, or try to fight the car. So when we're succumbing, what happens is that we're stuck in fight, flight, or freeze mode. And so we're not able to use any of the higher order thinking. It is difficult to engage the frontal lobe and think about planning, think about the future, think about consequences to our actions. So when there's an adverse event or long-term traumatic, toxic stress, we are in the succumbing phase where we're in the survival mode. We just need to survive this, fight, flight, or freeze. And then as we kind of move away from that survival mode, we're moving somewhat past the adverse event, we then survive with the impairment. So the immediate danger of the event or the events have begun to pass, and now we're surviving with impairment. We're trying to recover from the impact of that adverse event, but we're still impaired because we haven't fully recovered. And that impairment could be, we still have some fear, we still have some anxiety, we still have some hypervigilance or hyperarousal. We're on alert for that danger to come again. We could also have some psychological or psychiatric symptoms as well in that phase. And then as we move to past surviving with impairment and our symptoms begin to diminish, whether we've sought help or we learned how to process them ourselves, or we've done some self-care, or we're engaging in some of those things that help us to process, like yoga and meditation or spiritual practices that have helped us to overcome some of the impairment that we were still carrying. Then we move to what most of us think about as this idea of resilience, that we and resilience is returning to baseline. So we return back to the level of functioning where we were prior to the event. So resilience is returning back to baseline. And we're going to talk about post-traumatic growth, which goes beyond resilience. It goes beyond returning to baseline and what can happen where there's trauma. So 3 concepts within this kind of levels of functioning after trauma. The first is resistance. And so resistance is standing still or seemingly undisturbed or undeterred in the face of adversity. So when we think about the graph that I showed previously, resistance would be that the individual survived but really did not have any impairment, that they were able to move through the event seemingly undisturbed in the face of that adversity, that they came through and out of that adversity seemingly undisturbed, which is something that could happen to a small group of individuals or people, because we all are so diverse. The next one is recovery, and recovery is most closely related to resilience. One of my mentors who has passed away would often coin resilience as this idea of the ability to bounce back from a setback. So resilience, again, if you think about the graph that I showed, is this ability to return to baseline. What happens when there's adversity is that we make temporary accommodations like this palm tree, or adaptations to survive the adversity. We endure, and then we recover and return back to where we were prior to that adversity. However, a third concept in responding or reacting to trauma is the idea of reconfiguration. And reconfiguration is the idea of not making a temporary accommodation and then resuming original functioning, or in the case of this picture, not resuming original shape. But in reconfiguration, the person or the organism is changed. It changes its shape. There is a transformation that takes place. It does not return back to what it was prior to the adversity. It actually transforms. The reconfiguration, we must remember, can be negative or positive. However, it is the positive transformations that are most like post-traumatic growth, or what we think about in terms of post-traumatic growth. So going back to that graph, post-traumatic growth is akin to thriving. That thriving is a transformation beyond simply maintaining and returning to normal functioning. That we return to baseline and then we soar. We go beyond or further than we were prior to that adversity. So post-traumatic growth is a theory out of a section, a sector of psychology called called positive psychology. So it's out of the positive psychology literature, and the concept was discovered as a result of hearing people who had survived trauma refer to some positive changes that occurred as a result of attempting to cope in the aftermath of the traumatic life event. And so trauma survivors started to report some positive changes that they saw in their life as they try to rebuild their lives and themselves after experiencing a traumatic event. It is important to note that post-traumatic growth can be defined as the positive psychological changes that result from attempts to find new meaning following a traumatic event. And in the definition, it is not the event itself that causes the positive psychological changes, but rather what eventually results from the shattering of a person's fundamental beliefs, values, self-perceptions, and perceptions of others and the world. So a traumatic event kind of shatters our fundamental beliefs about the world. I am safe. I can protect myself from adversity. It shatters those fundamental beliefs. And so when we recover from a traumatic event, we have to basically create new meaning, create new fundamental beliefs, values, self-perceptions, and assumptions. And it is through trying to make meaning and creating that new meaning that we find meaning in the aftermath of trauma. And so in discovering individuals who have identified, there's some things that I found out about myself or that I noticed about myself after this event that weren't there before. They weren't part of my life and who I was prior to the traumatic event, through trying to reconstruct that. So imagine what has happened as a result of COVID-19. I'm quite sure it's safe to say that the majority of us on this webinar never thought in reality that there could be a global respiratory virus that would have us separated from each other, from our jobs, from the things that we love to do, from our freedoms for over a year. We had a fundamental assumption that we could walk outside and breathe the air and talk to other folks and breathe in their exhale. We had that fundamental belief. And this past year has kind of shattered that belief. And we begin to think, am I safe? Is there something else that's out there that could, impact me that I have no control over? So that's a fundamental belief. I know that after some of the protest for George Floyd, some people in my life who really didn't understand police brutality began to see it in a different way, understood it as a trauma that never impacted them personally, but began to see it and empathize with others. And so there was a fundamental assumption that many have had as a result of that uprising that was shattered, which was that the world is fair and that everyone has equal opportunity. And there are many who that assumption has been shattered. And we can say connectedly that some of that happened when we saw the storming of the Capitol. That doesn't happen in the United States. We're a democracy, right? So that fundamental assumptions are shattered. And as a result, as we move through and towards the light of returning to this next normal, what will become our normal lives, we have to then begin to create new ways of being in the world, begin to rebuild our identity. Who are we? How we see ourselves, how we see the world, how we see others, and how we see the future. And so there are 5 concepts that were identified in the original post-traumatic growth literature. And that is and these are domains where people reported positive changes as a result of experiencing a traumatic event. And that was improved sense of efficacy, change in how one relates to others, increased appreciation for life, new possibilities in life, and enhanced spiritual beliefs. And so these are some on this slide are some of the reports from trauma survivors where they saw this improved self-efficacy or beliefs about the self. They said after the trauma, they became stronger than they were before because they never knew that they could withstand such an adverse event. They said that they are a better self, that they are more empathetic to others who suffer. They feel more alive as a new zest for life. They feel more mature, that the adversity matured them in some way. They're more confident. They feel if I survived that, if I was able to traverse that, then I'm confident that I can overcome any other adversity that might happen. Some people report being more creative because the old ways that they were doing things don't work anymore, didn't work during the adversity. So they had to create new ways of being, new opportunities, new ways of getting their needs met. We were talking prior to the webinar how many people have become more tech savvy. It has propelled many of us who are of a certain mature age to really become friends with technology and move further faster than we might have had this not happened. So this idea of improved sense of self, those are some examples. Also, people reported changes in how they relate to others. So as a result of experiencing that adversity, they found a new appreciation for family and friends. They thought about how they took certain relationships for granted. I know many folks that I work with, and even myself, given that my family is really close, we're really close in proximity to each other, that I often took for granted that I could drive down the street for 6 minutes and be in a family member's home when I haven't been able to connect with them now, 2 miles down the street for months. So developing this new appreciation and closer relationship with family or friends, saying hi to neighbors, becoming connected to others who have experienced the same adversity, speaking to strangers, and also really kind of becoming aware of who their true friends are and desiring to have more close, true friends than more superficial acquaintances, right? And so discovering this new desire to have closeness and to be connected to others that they weren't prior to experiencing this adversity or this trauma. Increased appreciation for life. So being more aware of how fragile life is, how much or little time we have, how important it is to make the most of the time that we have, that we're all vulnerable and that life is not granted. And so there's an appreciation for even every day that I wake up, I'm appreciative. For my health, I'm appreciative. So finding an appreciation for life is also an area, and finding new possibilities in life, living in the here and now. It's the simple things that matter. Thinking about when this is over, or if I've survived this, maybe I'll learn a new skill. I know many people who have learned new skills online as a result of having to shelter in place. Stay-at-home orders. They've learned new skills. I was amazed to see that there was a charcuterie, I can't even say the word, charcuterie board making class online. So people were like, well, maybe this is something that I can do with myself, that there's still life to live. Also changing in, priorities. Who and how do I spend my day? That maybe it's not about monetary goods, but really thinking about who am I with, spending time with my loved ones, doing things that I've never done before, changing my life goals. And then, of course, enhance spiritual beliefs. Whenever there's a trauma, for many people, there's also this kind of existential crisis. So who am I in the grander scheme of things? Who is within the universe? What control do I have over my life, and what control does a higher being or the universe have over my life? That people begin to connect more with their spiritual selves, their spiritual practices, not necessarily religiosity, but spiritually, who am I as a being? So these are the 5 areas where they've identified clusters of reports from trauma survivors in the aftermath of surviving that trauma. The literature notes that, of course, these are not exhaustive areas, nor are they exhaustive in their reports of what many trauma survivors discuss after surviving the trauma. So it's not inclusive of everything. And that we know many other areas where people experience or express change, positive change after a traumatic event. Why did I present this today? Why did I feel it necessary for you to know about post-traumatic growth? Number one, because it's generally not taught. And number two, I think it's important for us to hold on to hope and to remember that we have survived to this point. Many of us have lost loved ones and friends, but we're here and we've survived, and there is an after. And that this experience over the past year does not mean that we don't have hope for the future, and that they're not positive changes that we may have experienced as a result. And so it is important for many of us to consciously think about, to consciously reflect on, how am I different from the way that I was 12 months ago? Because we've changed, we've all had to change. It's been 12 months. So just naturally we change and grow as human beings in some ways. But have you purposefully reflected on what's different about me? Is there anything that, although there have been some horrific things that have happened over the 12 months, is there anything about me that I would say is better than it was when it started? As I mentioned, I know I'm much better at technology than I was prior to this, these these pandemics that have hit the United States. I consider all three of them to be traumatic. So I've learned new skills. I really am like, I don't take my family for granted. I can't wait for us to get together. I said, when we get together, when it's safe, we're going to have a party for 24 hours, even if I fall asleep on the couch, because I go to sleep at 9:30. That reflect, and I invite you all to reflect on, are there changes in me as a result of this thing? And as you reflect on it, I want you to know that personal distress and post-traumatic growth can coexist. So post-traumatic growth is not just looking through your experience with rose-colored glasses and negating the pain and the distress that you felt and still feel and will continue to feel, especially around major losses. But to say, there were some bad and horrible things that happened. There were some extremely traumatic events that happened that will be with me for the rest of our life, for the rest of my life, for many of us. And in the midst of that, I discovered something new about myself, about life, about my priorities, that personal distress can exist and coexist with your personal growth. And so that's important for you to remember. The next thing that I want to talk about quickly, looking at the time, is self-compassion, practicing self-compassion. Self-compassion is simply compassion that is directed inward. Many of us might look back on this last 12 months and might not be happy with the way that we have responded to it, the way that we have acted. We might have some negative judgments about our behaviors, about our thoughts, about our beliefs. We might have some negative judgments. We might say, man, I could have done more. There's someone that I know who wrote 7 books and, started a new business, and all I could do was keep it together. Well, self-compassion says that when we reflect on our behaviors, we should reflect on our behaviors with self-kindness versus self-judgment. That we should be kind to ourselves, being understanding towards ourselves, that we understand, we look at ourselves with love versus self-criticism when we feel that we have failed or when we feel that we were inadequate. So looking at ourselves with self-kindness versus self-judgment. What would you say to a friend who is being critical towards themselves about a shortcoming? Whatever you would say to encourage that friend, turn that inward and encourage yourself. Secondly, Think about common humanity versus isolation. Remember, we've all experienced collective trauma. So give yourself self-compassion in recognizing that the human condition is imperfect and that we are not alone in our suffering. And we are also not alone in our imperfection. Rather, our imperfections are what make us a card-carrying member of the human race. Remember that we are not alone, that we are not isolated in our experiences, our thoughts, our feelings around this trauma, that there's a common humanity we've all experienced. And we have, although are in a different boat, we all have experienced the storm. And then lastly, think about self-compassion is about being mindful, which means being in the present and being aware of your present experience with acceptance. So what does that mean? We've lost some people. How are you feeling in the moment? You might feel at this moment pain and sorrow because of that loss. Allow yourself to feel it with acceptance and without judgment. And in those moments where you feel joy, allow yourself to feel joy without feeling guilt or shame because of the suffering of others, or even because they're suffering within your family or close friend group. That we allow ourselves to feel in the moment what we feel, that we do not live in the past and hold on and harness the past, because that is a pathway to depression. And we don't have extreme anxiety about the future and what we can't control, because that's a pathway to anxiety. So how are we right now in the moment? Feel it and allow yourself to accept it without judgment. And then the last thing that I would say is remember to have an attitude of gratitude, that it is important for us to find little things every day to be grateful for. Sometimes when people say, what are you grateful for? Many people respond to those big things or big people in their lives, those big, salient, significant things. But every day, there's one thing to be grateful for. We have to remember to have a spirit or an attitude of gratitude, because gratitude builds optimism. And optimism helps to make you resilient to adversity. Research has shown that gratitude converts stress into positive energy that's necessary to overcome challenges. Gratitude improves physical and mental health, and gratitude is a natural form of antidepressant. It helps those hormones in the brain to wake up, and it helps you to not live in a space of sadness and depression, but to see hope and to see a future and to be thankful and to live in the moment. That is that is what I wish for everyone who is here today. Thank you. Nancy, you're on mute.
Thank you. I've obviously not learned as much as you have about technology. I can't even manage my mute button. But thank you so much for your insightful perspectives on trauma and particularly recovery. And I'm going to give you a second to maybe catch your breath and take a sip of water. But I'm going to express my gratitude and improve my own physical and mental health by really thanking you for this and really insightful talk. We've received a few questions, and so we'd like to proceed with the first one, but certainly want to welcome you home to the CSU system, and so happy that your son will soon be graduating and joining the ranks of CSU alumni. Very fine people. So our first question is really, I think, we got it from several people. Will the PowerPoint be available to download after the presentation? There was so much material in there.
Most definitely. Most definitely. Yeah, if you just tell me how to do that, I can send it and you all can post it. to wherever you post things. I don't know that much about technology. So most
Thank
definitely,
you.
I'll make it available. Yes.
Yes, we have a wonderful Wellbeing U website, on our homepage, and we would love to showcase your PowerPoint because we have many resources on that page, and then people turn to it, especially during this pandemic.
I'm happy to share. Happy to share it.
Wonderful. Great. So we're thinking, one question we received was, first year students have not experienced life in a college classroom, and this may be a big stressor for them in the fall. Do you have any quick advice to share for them?
What I would, the advice that I would suggest would kind of be twofold. How feasible it is for the university, but would be twofold. The first, I would say, would be to increase communication to those incoming freshmen, and help to give them what we call stress inoculation. So as much information as you can give them about what they can expect in dorm life. What is the experience of either dorm life or either being on a college campus, whether that's through videos of other students who, are sophomores or juniors talking about what they can expect. Again, a hallmark of trauma is this feeling of not being in control. And the way that we combat that is making survivors as equipped as they can be to handle or, to surmount the next thing that is out of their control so that they don't feel helpless. So to prepare them as well as you can before they come with as much information as you can give them. And then the next thing that I would do, I would suggest would be to double up on the whatever they can do, whatever you do to have students connect to each other. We have been so disconnected that when we're able to come back together, that we need to do that as much as possible. As much as possible. We have to re-socialize ourselves to socialize. And that those, so the, right. And so as much as we can get students to interact with each other, to connect freshmen with upperclassmen, to create relationships and with other freshmen, we need to double our efforts. We have to do something, right, that is not normal because this new school year won't be normal. So those
Absolutely.
are two, right? Those are two things that I would suggest.
Oh, great. Those are great tips. Thank you. Then we have a question, about young children. Many of the participants today have young children at home. Can you give us a suggestion on how to help young ones through the stress of the pandemic?
Oh, that's a huge one. I have some of my students where I teach, and also some of my clients have been home with their children, right, for over a year with really young children, which can be stressful on the parents as well. And so a couple of things that I would say for parents who have young children at home is the question about the young children also transitioning back into school, or just helping young children as they're at home in the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so helping children as they're at home in the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
So what I would suggest is to provide a sense of structure, routine, and regularity as much as possible, and provide opportunities for the children to explore their normal curiosity, which I know is hard for some people because they're taking care of their children while they're also trying to work or do schoolwork. So it can be very difficult. But as much as you can, have a routine for them so that they know what's coming next, so that they know what to expect. What's coming next. And then also for young children who, let's say maybe 5 or 6 and them starting school, kindergarten was delayed, or they were just in first grade, they did 1 year and now they're at home. I would also continue to have regular conversations with your children about school, right? So at 5, 6, and 7, they are developmentally can understand a concept of school. If you have any books at home about this is the school bus and this is the school and this is what a teacher is, so that if they're going back to school or they're just starting school, it's not foreign to them. They're not looking at this like I've been with at home with my caregivers for 7 years and now you're so preparing them and talk about you're going to go to school and you're going to meet friends. So preparing them for school. But I would say the best thing for young kids is for them to have some sort of routine that includes some kind of learning, interactions with adults and primary caregivers, playtime, exploration time outside, that in some way to work that into your daily routine with them.
Great, thank you. Here's a little shift. We have a question here about having a hard time figuring out how to express gratitude. Can you recommend any books on gratitude?
That is a really good question. Wow. I know there are a couple, there's actually a workbook on gratitude, but I can't think of the author right now, but there's a workbook on gratitude. What I can do is I can put together a slide on my PowerPoint that I'll share with you that has some of the resources that I used even when I was doing this talk. But if you can see, I have 3 bookcases. You see one behind me. So sometimes I'm like, there's a book on that, but it's somewhere in these 300 books on my shelf. But yeah, there's also in LA, when things open up, again, planning for the future. There will be a future. There's also, if you haven't heard about it, there's a Cafe Gratitude that is a restaurant that passes out card. If you get a coffee, they give you a little gratitude card. So there's a Cafe Gratitude as well. But what I'll do is I can put some of that on the PowerPoint slide. And if there are any other resources, I can create a resource slide and share it with you so folks can have it.
That would be wonderful. I know we'd look forward to seeing that. Thank you. Then we have a question here on how to articulate spirituality to people, even those who do not believe in God or religion.
That is a great question. And I would say, I don't think there's a blanket answer for that. I think you would have to really assess the person and the place. Again, one of my areas that I present on a lot is the integration of Christianity and psychology. And one thing that I practice for myself is that I can talk about my own beliefs and my own spiritual beliefs, but I never project that onto other people. I allow for people to have whatever beliefs they have, whether there is a spiritual belief in practice or whether there isn't, and I don't have an expectation. But if someone asks me about, what are some of the coping things that I do, I can talk about my own spiritual practices as mine and allow them to, and then talk and integrate others like yoga, like meditation, those kinds of things. So the one thing that I would say about that is, number one, assess the place and also the person. So what is the context in which the conversation is having? But it's always, whenever talking about any sphere of diversity, talk about your own experience and not project that onto other people.
That makes sense. That's great advice. Thank you. I know you spoke about self-compassion, but we have a question here about how to help others in whom we might notice signs of post-traumatic stress. So, how do we help others if we're not a therapist ourselves?
Right. So when talking about helping someone else who is experiencing symptoms of PTSD or even, toxic stress, it's kind of like what I said before, recognizing your own capacity and capabilities, because you might want to help and then it becomes a burden and impacts you. So recognize what you're willing to give and to do. And what I would say is, again, depending on the context and who you're offering assistance to, the most important thing that you can do is be available to listen. Right? So the best support that the foundational support that you can give to anyone who is in distress is to listen, to ask them, what do they need from you and what can you do to help them? So ask them. And if, let's say it's a person, there's a difference between having a personal relationship and offering support and having a professional relationship. If it's a personal relationship, depending on your connection to the person and what you know about the person, you may say to them, I see that you're struggling a little bit and I want to be here to help you.
Mhm.
How can I support you? So you can let them know that you see that they're having some challenges, but that you're here to support and not to judge. And ask them, but before you do that, be realistic about your internal and external resources. Like
Mhm.
what ways you can help, because they might ask you for $15,000. So so have that boundary clear for yourself, because again, we're all impacted in some way, and you don't want to overextend yourself when your resources are actually really low as well. But again, listen and ask them, what do they need from you? And check in on your friends. Check in on every so often on my Instagram. I'll put a meme up that says, just checking on my strong, independent, resilient friends. How are you doing? Right? Because so many of us have been taught to just power through. And it's like sometimes you need to check on your strong friends. So just checking in and saying, hey, I'm checking in on you, makes people feel seen and not alone.
Right. That's great. That's great advice. I know listening and support doesn't take any special training. You just have to be
Right.
present and authentic. So
Exactly.
wonderful.
Exactly.
Great. So this question appears to come from a student. So how can I cope with losing family and friends from COVID and trying to balance work and school at the same time?
It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's really, really, really hard. Um, what I would say, um, what I would say is it's important not to cope alone, that you have to find a support system. And although we can't be together, I think this has been this is one of those ways that there's some positive that's come out of this last year. There are so many grief groups and support groups that are online now, right? So before, you would have to find one in your city that's at a time that, in LA, that you could drive to. Now you can be in the comfort of your own home and sign up for a small group. And there are a lot of now loss groups. And if they're facilitated by a lay person, right? So not a professional, a lay professional, it doesn't even have to be in the state of California. So you could have greater anonymity as well. So what I would say is, I could also add some resources at the end of the site, at the end of my PowerPoint for that as well. But I would say first, don't do it alone. Losing loved ones and friends is already isolating, right? And you feel alone in that loss. And so having support at this time in the way that we can, I would say, is most important. The second thing that I would say is be honest with yourself about how you're feeling. Again, this idea about powering through is so ingrained in many of us. Take time to allow yourself to feel. Now, I also want to be real, right? I want to be real, which is my hallmark. Sometimes it gets me in trouble. I know the demands of working and going to school.
Right.
Been there, right?
Right.
I understand. So I understand that sometimes clinicians and therapists and psychologists will tell you to take all of this woo-woo time, and you're like, I barely have a time to shower. So I understand the reality of that. So what I've told my clients who are facing the realities and the strains of life demands is to schedule time for you to grieve. Put on your calendar that Saturday morning from 8 to 11, I'm going to allow myself to feel all that grief that I couldn't feel because I had to show up to work and I had to show up to school. And do that a couple of times a week. I had to learn to do that myself. And what I did was I compiled 4 movies, because I love movies, that were very, very emotional movies that always made me cry. Because I had to get into the emotion. I had to get there. So there are 4 movies that I would look at sometimes on a Saturday morning, and it would open the floodgates. And then I'm like, I don't need the movie anymore. I can think about those losses. I can think about those challenges. I can think about those struggles. So calendar yourself time to grieve, and also calendar yourself time for self-care. Put yourself on the schedule.
That's great. I hope you put those 4 movies on your resource list. I'll be
Okay,
looking forward to those.
I will.
Okay, well, one final question comes from a faculty member. How can professors support their students who have suffered toxic stress?
I think, I know we because I teach at a university, we've been talking about this a lot and kind of thinking like, so, what I would say is even acknowledging to students, sometimes I've gone into classrooms, we're on quarter system at the beginning of the quarter, and I'll just do a check-in. How are we doing? And students will say, you're the first instructor that's asked us that.
Oh,
Many
so
just,
nice.
right? Many just jump in. So I'm like, you know what? We can take 20 minutes to talk about how you're doing on the first class, right? Also offer yourself as a resource and support. We have office hours. So again, doubly encourage. We generally encourage students to reach out to us, really hammer that point home. If you're struggling, if you're having difficulty, please talk to me. Let's talk about it. Let's work it out. Let me be a resource for you to connect. So those are 2 things. I mean, just simply checking in with them and just saying, how are folks doing? And reminding them that you're a resource, even if, because we know that for some, their academics have suffered because of the things that they're experiencing, right? So even talking to them about that, if you find yourself being challenged by the material or the requirements of the course, please talk to me. And let them know that this is not just, an LA polite invitation, that this is a real invitation. So those are 2 things that I would suggest.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I know if I were a student, I'd want to be in your class. But Dr. Holmes, thank you so much for speaking with us this afternoon. I know I learned a great deal about trauma and toxic stress. I'm certainly going to remember that we're all in the same storm, but not in the same boat. I mean, that's just an incredible image and so, so true. But truly, I feel like this is the ideal time for this talk. We are working ourselves through this pandemic. Now that we have the vaccine, we truly are, in a phase of post-traumatic growth. And I think that we can realize those possibilities that you shared with us this afternoon. So thank you so much. I think I could have talked to you all afternoon, and I'm sure that our participants will share my opinion. So thank you again very, very much. And we will have your presentation available on our Wellbeing U website. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.